Shame stains far deeper than the street mud of Oakmere ever could. Emmeline was entirely out of options, left standing at the train platform, with nothing but a battered trunk and the echoing laughter of a man who had deemed her too plain to marry. Suddenly, a broad shadow blocked out the harsh frontier sun. Smelling of pine pitch sweat and raw leather, the stranger offered neither pity nor a helping hand. He simply looked down at her ruined dress and asked a single infuriating question. "Can you cook?" The Wyoming sun was a physical weight pressing down on the back of Emmeline's neck. She stood frozen on the boardwalk, her fingers clamped so tightly around the leather handle of her trunk that her knuckles burned stark white against the dirt on her skin. A fly buzzed past her ear. Somewhere down the street, a blacksmith's hammer struck an anvil. Clang, clang. "I paid for a woman, not a drowned rat in a burlap sack." The words still hung in the heavy, stagnant air. Arthur Hayes, the cattle rancher who had paid her train fare from Chicago, hadn't bothered to lower his voice. He stood 10 feet away, flanked by 2 ranch hands, who were trying and failing to hide their smirks. Hayes was a handsome man, sharply dressed in a tailored vest, smelling faintly of bay rum and expensive cigars. He had taken one look at Emmeline as she stepped off the Union Pacific, her hair matted to her forehead with sweat, the hem of her only decent wool dress caked in a noxious mix of train soot and horse manure from a slip on the platform, and he had balked. The agreement was for a respectable, presentable wife, Hayes announced to the gathering crowd of onlookers. He adjusted his bowler hat. "You don't look like you could survive a week out here, let alone host a proper Sunday supper. I'll buy your return ticket, miss. Consider it charity." He turned his back. He actually turned his back and walked away. Emmeline didn't cry. The urge was there, a hard, acidic lump at the base of her throat, but the humiliation burned too hot for tears. The townspeople women in faded calico, men leaning against hitching posts with completely open staring eyes, watched her. She was a spectacle, a rejected mail-order bride, a piece of damaged freight. She looked down at her boots. The leather was scuffed and peeling. She had precisely $3 in her coin purse. A return ticket would take her back to a damp, windowless room in a Chicago tenement and a factory job that had already cost her the hearing in her left ear. She would rather die in the dirt of this nameless street. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring. The show was over. Then the floorboards of the walkway groaned. A heavy, rhythmic thud of boots approached, slow and deliberate. Emmeline didn't look up until a pair of massive, dirt-caked boots stopped inches from her own. The leather was greased and scarred, held together by raw sinew. She tracked her gaze upward, past canvas trousers, stiff with dried mud, and blood, past a heavy flannel shirt that had seen better decades, up to a face half hidden by a sprawling, untamed beard, the color of rusted iron. He was huge, not just tall but broad, taking up too much space on the narrow boardwalk. He smelled aggressively of the wild, crushed pine needles, wood smoke-cured meat, and old, unwashed sweat. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her the way a man appraises a sturdy, slightly bruised apple at a market. "You cook." His voice was a low rumble, abrasive like stones grinding in a riverbed. Emmeline blinked the sheer absurdity of the question, snapping her out of her shock. "Excuse me. Asked if you can cook." He repeated, his face completely impassive. His eyes, peering out from beneath the brim of a battered felt hat, were a startling, pale grey. "I don't need a host for Sunday supper. I need someone to keep the stove burning and the meat from rotting while I'm on the trap line." Emmeline stared at him. The smell of him was overwhelming. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of whalebone corset. She was terrified. She was exhausted. But mostly the burning, vicious pride that had kept her alive in the slums flared to life. "I can cook," she said, her voice cracking over the dry dust in her throat. She cleared it, straightening her spine. "I can bake, I can butcher a chicken, and I can make a stew out of a boot heel if I have to," the big man grunted. It wasn't an agreement, just an acknowledgement. "Good. Magistrate's down the street." He reached down, grabbed the heavy leather handle of her trunk with one hand, and hoisted it onto his massive shoulder, as if it weighed no more than a flour sack. He didn't wait for her. He just turned and started walking toward a squat, whitewashed building at the end of the thoroughfare. Emmeline stood there for a split second, looked back at the train tracks, looked at the broad, retreating back of the mountain man. She hitched up her ruined skirt and followed him. The marriage ceremony took less than 3 minutes. Magistrate Miller, a sweaty, balding man who clearly wanted to get back to his lunch, mumbled through the vows. The room smelled of stale whiskey and old paper. "Do you, Gordon Cross, take this woman?" Gordon didn't look at her. He stared at the wall behind the magistrate. "I do." "And do you, Emmeline?" "I do." She interrupted, eager to be done with the farce. There was no ring. Gordon slapped 2 silver dollars onto the magistrate's desk. The metal clinked sharply. He turned to Emmeline. "Wagons out back." That was it. She was Mrs. Gordon Cross. As she followed him out the back door into the blinding afternoon sun, she realized she had just traded a public humiliation for total isolation with a giant she knew absolutely nothing about. The panic finally settled in, cold and sharp in her gut, but she clamped her teeth together. She had made her bed. Now she had to ride in it. The wagon was a brutal contraption of rough-hewn pine and iron wheels with zero give. The 2 mules hitched to it, a scarred grey and a mean-looking brown, flicked their ears back as Gordon threw her trunk into the bed. It landed with a heavy thud against sacks of flour tins of coffee and wooden crates filled with iron traps. "Climb up," he ordered. He didn't offer a hand. Emmeline placed her foot on the iron step, her petticoats catching on a splintered board. She hauled herself up onto the hard wooden bench, her breath catching as the tight lacing of her corset dug mercilessly into her lower ribs. Gordon untied the mules, climbed up beside her, and took the reins. The bench sank under his weight, tilting Emmeline slightly toward him. She rigidly leaned away, grasping the side of the wagon. He clicked his tongue a sharp tusk, and the mules lurched forward. The first hour was agonizing. The road out of Oakmere was nothing more than a rutted dirt trail baked hard by the sun. Every stone, every dip in the earth translated directly up through the wagon's axles into Emmeline's spine. Her teeth rattled. Dust plumed up around them, coating her lips and sticking to the sweat on her face. She tasted grit every time she swallowed. Gordon drove in absolute silence. He was a statue beside her, his massive forearms relaxed but steady on the thick leather lines. She kept waiting for the catch. The cruelty. In her experience, men who bought women out of desperation eventually exacted their toll. She waited for him to demand gratitude, to touch her knee, to make some lewd remark about their wedding night. She braced for it, her muscles locked tight. But he didn't even look at her. His pale grey eyes scanned the horizon, then the tree line, as the plains began to rise into foothills. By the 3rd hour, the heat broke, replaced by a creeping, biting chill. The trail narrowed, winding upward into dense, towering pines. The sunlight splintered through the heavy canopy, casting long, bruised shadows across the forest floor. The smell changed. Gone was the baked dust and horse sweat of the town, replaced by the sharp medicinal tang of pine needles, damp earth, and decaying wood. Emmeline shivered. Her wool dress, stifling in town, was suddenly useless against the mountain drafts. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, rubbing her sleeves. Gordon noticed the movement out of the corner of his eye. He didn't speak. He reached behind him with one hand, rummaged in the back of the wagon blindly, and hauled out a heavy, coarse blanket. It looked like it was made of woven sheep's wool grey and unwashed. He tossed it onto her lap. It smelled strongly of wet dog and wood smoke. "Wrap up," he muttered. "Gets colder at the ridge." Emmeline hesitated. The blanket was filthy, but a sharp gust of wind cut through her corset, and survival won out over fastidiousness. She pulled the heavy wool around her shoulders. It was surprisingly warm. "Thank you," she managed to say. Her voice sounded thin and weak in the massive silence of the forest. He grunted. They rode for 2 more hours. The incline grew so steep that the mules were lathered in white sweat, their breathing a ragged rasp in the quiet air. Emmeline's stomach let out a long, pathetic gurgle. She hadn't eaten since the stale bread on the train yesterday morning. The hunger was moving past a dull ache into a sharp, nauseating pain. She bit the inside of her cheek to distract herself, tasting the copper tang of her own blood. Finally, as the last bloody streaks of sunset faded behind the peaks, leaving the woods in a deep purple twilight, the wagon crested a ridge. The trees broke, revealing a small, cleared plateau. In the center sat a cabin. It was not a picture book homestead. It was a functional, brutal structure made of massive, unpeeled logs. The roof was pitched steep to shed snow covered in rough cedar shakes. There were no curtains in the 2 small, deeply recessed windows. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, mingling with the dark sky. A chopping block with a hatchet buried deep in the wood sat near the door. Gordon pulled back on the reins. "Whoa!" The wagon jerked to a halt. The sudden lack of motion was almost as jarring as the ride itself. Emmeline's legs felt like lead as she carefully climbed down. Her boots hit the soft, pine needle-covered ground, and her knees immediately buckled. She caught herself against the wagon wheel, gasping as her cramped muscles protested. Gordon didn't notice or didn't care. He was already unhitching the mules. "Go inside," he said, not looking at her. "Lamps on the table. Matches in the tin next to it." He led the mules toward a lean-to at the edge of the clearing. Emmeline stood alone in the gathering dark. The cold was absolute, now seeping into her bones. The wind howled through the high branches, a lonely, desolate sound that made her chest tighten. She looked at the heavy timber door of the cabin. This was it. The end of the line. She gathered her skirts and pushed the door open. The inside of the cabin was pitch black and freezing. It smelled strongly of cured tobacco grease and the stale ashes of a dead fire. Emmeline stood in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust to the gloom. She felt along the rough-hewn logs of the wall, stepping carefully over the threshold. Her boot bumped against something hard and metallic on the floor, a trap, maybe. She swallowed hard, extending her hands into the darkness. Her fingers brushed the edge of a heavy wooden table. She patted the surface until her hand closed around the cool glass base of an oil lamp. Right beside it, her knuckles knocked against a metal tin. Her hands were shaking. The cold had numbed her fingers, making them clumsy and stupid. She popped the lid off the tin, pulled out a lucifer match and struck it against the table's edge. It snapped. She cursed softly a foul word she'd picked up in the Chicago factories and pulled another. This time the match flared to life, casting a small, shaking sphere of yellow light. She quickly touched it to the wick of the lamp and placed the glass chimney back over it. The cabin sprang into view. It was exactly as rough as the outside promised. A single, large room. In one corner, a massive bed frame built directly into the logs covered in thick bear and wolf pelts. A cast-iron wood stove dominated the opposite wall, surrounded by stacks of split firewood. The walls were adorned with rifles, drying skins stretched on willow hoops, and cast-iron skillets hanging from nails. It was a man's space. Utilitarian, violently practical. There wasn't a single soft thing in the room. The heavy door groaned open behind her. Gordon stepped in, carrying her trunk on one shoulder and a large sack of provisions on the other. He dropped the trunk at the foot of the bed with a thud that rattled the floorboards. He dumped the sack onto the table. "Stove needs lighting," he said, turning to look at her. "There's salt pork in the pantry box, beans soaked in the crock. Make 'em hot." He didn't wait for a response. He grabbed a lantern, lit it from hers, and walked back out the door, presumably to finish tending the animals. Emmeline stared at the closed door. Make 'em hot. The sheer audacity of his demand cut through her exhaustion. Her feet were bruised, her ribs ached, her stomach was eating itself, and she was expected to immediately assume the role of the dutiful pioneer wife. She wanted to throw the lamp at the wall. She wanted to scream. Instead, she let out a shaky, ragged breath, walked over to the stove, and knelt on the rough floorboards. The question echoed in her head. "Can you cook?" She opened the heavy iron door of the stove. It was full of grey ash. She found a small iron shovel and scraped it out, coughing, as the fine dust plumed into her face, sticking to her sweaty forehead. She arranged a handful of dry kindling from the woodbox, placing some shaved cedar bark beneath it. Striking another match, she held it to the bark. It smoked, sputtered, and died. "Damn it!" she hissed through her teeth. She tried again. The flame licked the bark, curling the edges, but the draught from the chimney was cold and pushed the smoke right back out into her face. Her eyes watered, stinging fiercely. She wiped them with the back of her dirty hand, leaving a soot smear across her cheek. Third time. She rearranged the sticks, struck the match and blew gently. The flame caught. It crept up, the kindling crackling softly. She fed it a larger piece of split pine, watching with desperate relief as the fire finally took hold, throwing a warm orange glow across her face. She stood up, her knees popping, and found the pantry box. It was a heavy wooden chest lined with tin. Inside, a slab of salt pork wrapped in butcher paper lay next to a small sack of flour. A heavy earthenware crock sat on top of the chest. She lifted the lid. Beans swimming in murky water. She grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the wall. It was impossibly heavy slick with old polymerized grease. She hauled it to the stove, setting it over the hottest plate. Finding a knife on the table, she hacked at the salt pork. The meat was tough, the knife dull. She sawed through it, her palm blistering against the wooden handle of the blade. She managed to cut off 3 ragged chunks and tossed them into the heating skillet. The fat hit the hot iron with a vicious hiss. A drop of boiling grease spat upward, landing squarely on her wrist. Emmeline gasped, jerking her hand back. The pain was sharp and sudden. She looked down at the angry red welt instantly forming on her pale skin. She didn't cry, but a profound, crushing sense of isolation washed over her. She was 1,000,000 miles from anywhere married to a stranger, cooking tough meat in a dark box on a mountain. She raised her wrist to her mouth and pressed her lips against the burn, sucking on the stinging flesh, tasting salt and soot. The door opened. Gordon walked in, bringing a rush of freezing air with him. He hung his heavy canvas coat on a peg by the door, took off his hat, and ran a massive hand through his thick, tangled hair. He looked at the stove. He looked at Emmeline, standing there, holding her wrist to her mouth. He walked over to the table, pulled out a wooden chair, and sat down. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He didn't offer a remedy. "Smells like it's burning," he said flatly. Emmeline dropped her wrist. She grabbed a wooden spoon, marched back to the stove, and violently pushed the pork around the skillet. The edges were indeed blackening. She grabbed the heavy crock of beans, and with a grunt of effort, tipped it over the skillet. The water and beans splashed into the hot fat, creating a massive cloud of steam, that smelled heavily of salt and earth. She stirred it aggressively, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. 10 minutes later, she served it. She found 2 tin plates in a cupboard and spooned the slop onto them. She set one down in front of Gordon with a metallic clatter. She took her own plate to the far end of the table and sat down. Gordon picked up a fork. He didn't pray. He didn't wait. He just started eating, shoveling the food into his mouth with mechanical efficiency. Emmeline picked up her own fork. Her hand was trembling so badly she could barely keep the beans on the tines. She took a bite. It was heavily salted, slightly burnt on the edges, and the beans were still tough in the middle. It was terrible. She chewed, forcing it down her tight throat. Gordon finished his plate in under 2 minutes. He scraped the last bean up, set the fork down, and leaned back in his chair. He looked at her across the flickering lamplight. Emmeline stopped chewing, meeting his gaze defensively, waiting for the criticism, waiting for him to call her a liar, to throw the plate against the wall. Gordon wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Fire's holding good," he said. He stood up, walked over to the bed and kicked his boots off. He didn't take off his clothes. He just lay down on top of the furs facing the wall, his massive bulk taking up more than half the mattress. "Blow out the lamp when you're done," he muttered to the wall. Within seconds, the deep, rhythmic sound of his snoring filled the cabin. Emmeline sat at the table alone. She looked at her half-empty plate, then at the man sleeping heavily in the corner. The tension that had been keeping her spine rigid since the train platform slowly began to uncoil, replaced by a bone-deep, overwhelming exhaustion. He hadn't praised her, but he hadn't punished her either. She was here. She had survived day 1. She ate the rest of her terrible beans, stood up and blew out the lamp. Dawn didn't break on the mountain. It bled through the pines, a bruised, heavy grey that offered no warmth. Emmeline woke to the sharp crack of an axe biting into wood. She lay perfectly still under the crushing weight of the furs, her breath pluming in the freezing air of the cabin. The stove had burned down to embers in the night. The water in the tin pitcher on the washstand was frozen solid. She turned her head. The space beside her on the mattress was empty. The depression Gordon had left was already cold. She forced herself out of bed, biting her lip to stifle a gasp as her bare feet hit the icy floorboards. She dressed in a frantic, shivering rush, pulling her heavy wool skirt over her stiff petticoats. Her fingers, red and clumsy, fumbled with the corset laces. She tied them loosely, not caring about the shape. Up here, a waistline was a useless vanity. When she pushed the heavy timber door open, the cold hit her like a physical blow. It smelled of impending snow and crushed cedar. Gordon was at the chopping block, his flannel shirt rolled up to his elbows despite the biting frost. He swung the heavy maul with mechanical, terrifying efficiency. Thwack, crack. A thick round of pine split neatly in 2. He tossed the halves onto a pile that was already taller than Emmeline. He didn't stop swinging when she stepped onto the porch. He didn't even look up. "Water's low," he said, timing the words between the swing and the impact. Thwack. Creek's a 1/4 mile down the north slope. Path is marked with blazes. He buried the maul in the block and turned to her. His beard was frosted with his own breath. "I'm checking the lower trap line. Won't be back till dark. There's a rifle above the door. Don't touch it unless a bear tries to come through the window. And don't burn the beans again." He grabbed his canvas coat, a coil of rope and a heavy pack, and walked off into the tree line without a backward glance. Emmeline watched him disappear into the dense, dark timber. The silence that rushed in to fill the space he left was absolute. It wasn't the quiet of an empty room. It was the heavy, watching silence of the deep woods. It made her ears ring. In Chicago there was always noise, The clatter of horse hooves on cobblestone, the mechanical shriek of the factory, looms, the muffled arguments through thin tenement walls. Here there was only the wind. She found 2 wooden buckets by the door. They were heavy, banded in iron. She picked them up, the rough hemp rope handles biting into her palms, and started looking for the blazed trees. The walk down was treacherous. The ground was slick with frozen dew and decaying pine needles. Her leather boots made for flat city streets had no grip. She slid twice, catching herself on rough bark that scraped the skin from her knuckles. When she finally reached the creek, she wanted to cry. It was wide, fast-moving, and edges were capped in thick, white ice. She set the buckets down her chest, heaving. Her corset felt like an iron cage around her ribs. She found a heavy rock and smashed it against the ice until it fractured, sending freezing water splashing up onto her skirt. The wool soaked it up instantly, turning heavy and cold against her calves. Filling the buckets was easy. Lifting them was another matter entirely. Water is incredibly heavy. Emmeline hoisted the first bucket, her shoulder joint popping ominously. She grabbed the second. Her center of gravity shifted violently. She took one step up the steep, muddy bank, and her right foot slipped. She went down hard on her knees. The right bucket tipped, spilling 3 gallons of freezing water directly down the front of her dress. Emmeline sat in the mud, staring at the spilled bucket. The cold seeping into her skin was instantaneous and vicious. A hot, acidic ball of pure rage swelled in her chest. She hated the mud. She hated the cold. She hated Arthur Hayes for leaving her on that platform, and she absolutely loathed the giant who had bought her like a draft horse and left her here to freeze. She opened her mouth and let out a sound she had never made before. It wasn't a ladylike sob. It was a harsh, ragged scream of pure frustration that echoed off the canyon walls, scattering a flock of crows from the upper branches. The scream emptied her out. She sat breathing heavily, her throat raw. No one was coming to help her. No one cared if she froze in the mud. Emmeline wiped her running nose on her wet sleeve, leaving a smear of dirt across her pale face. She grabbed the bucket, marched back to the hole in the ice, and filled it again. The climb back up took an hour. She stopped every 20 paces, her arms trembling so violently the water sloshed over the rims. By the time she reached the cabin, her hands were locked into claws, the skin across her palms torn and bleeding from the rough rope. She hauled the buckets inside, dropped them by the washstand, and collapsed into the chair by the cold stove. She was soaked, bleeding, and alone. But the buckets were full. She looked at her raw, shaking hands. She didn't cry. She stood up, grabbed the kindling, and started the fire. The first snow didn't fall. It was driven sideways by a screaming wind. It had been 4 days since Emmeline hauled her first bucket of water. 4 days of grueling, monotonous labor. She learned that green wood, smoked and dried wood, burned too fast. She learned that salt pork had to be boiled twice to remove the stinging brine before it was edible. She learned that her body, accustomed to the repetitive confined movements of a factory loom, was agonizingly weak when faced with the raw demands of the mountain. Gordon remained a massive, silent fixture in her life. He left before dawn and returned after dark, smelling of blood and wet animal fur. He ate whatever she put in front of him, dumped his pelts in the shed, and slept facing the wall. He never asked how her day was. She never asked how many traps he'd checked. On the afternoon of the 5th day, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. The temperature plummeted so fast, the logs of the cabin popped and groaned as the sap inside them froze. Emmeline was at the table trying to darn a hole in Gordon's spare wool sock with numb fingers when the door slammed open. The wind howled into the cabin, blowing out the lamp instantly. Emmeline jumped to her feet. Gordon stood in the doorway, a hulking silhouette against the driving white snow. He was dragging something massive behind him. He stepped inside, leaned his weight forward, and hauled the carcass of a buck mule deer over the threshold. The animal's head lolled antlers, scraping horribly against the floorboards. He kicked the door shut, cutting off the shriek of the wind. The cabin instantly filled with the heavy metallic stench of fresh, blood-wet hide, and the sharp, musky odor of the wild animal. Gordon was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his snow-caked coat. He dropped the rope tied around the deer's neck and leaned against the wall, wiping his face with a bloody hand. There was a long, jagged tear in his canvas trousers, and the fabric underneath was stained a dark, rusty brown. "Get the knives," he ordered, his voice ragged. "The heavy butcher and the skinning blade. Heat a kettle of water." Emmeline stared at the dead animal. Its eyes were open, glazed and black. Blood pooled slowly from a hole in its neck, soaking into the rough wood floor. Her stomach heaved violently. She clamped a hand over her mouth, tasting bile. I can't," she whispered, stepping back. Gordon pushed himself off the wall. He didn't look angry, just impatient. "It'll freeze solid if we leave it till morning. We need the meat. We need the hide. Get the knives." "I don't know how to butcher a deer." Her voice pitched up thin and panicked. She backed up until her hips hit the iron stove. "I cut up chickens in Chicago. It's huge. It smells." Gordon closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides. He loomed over her, a mountain of wet canvas and blood. "This ain't Chicago," he growled. "You eat meat, then you pull your weight. Grab the damn knife." He turned his back on her, kneeling beside the carcass. He pulled a folding knife from his pocket and drove it into the soft white belly of the deer, dragging it downward with a sickening tearing sound. The smell hit Emmeline in a wave of hot, humid offal and raw meat. She gagged. She actually bent over the woodbox and dry heaved, her eyes watering. Gordon didn't look up. He kept cutting. Emmeline stood up. She wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist. She looked at the blood on the floor, the tear in Gordon's pants, the sheer amount of work required to break the animal down. If she refused, he would do it himself. He wouldn't hit her. He wouldn't yell. He would simply categorize her as useless a burden he had to carry. She walked over to the table, grabbed the heavy butcher knife, and knelt in the pooling blood on the opposite side of the deer. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice shaking violently. Gordon paused. He looked at her, his pale eyes tracking the tremor in her hands. He reached out and wrapped his massive blood-slicked hand over hers, adjusting her grip on the heavy wooden handle of the knife. His skin was freezing cold, but his grip was like a vice. "Blade up!" he instructed, his voice dropping slightly in volume. "Slide it under the hide. Don't puncture the meat. Just cut the connective tissue. Follow my line." He let go of her hand. Emmeline pressed the blade against the slick white fascia beneath the skin. Her hand slipped. The blade nicked the meat. "Slower," he said. He didn't yell. She adjusted her grip, gritted her teeth, and pushed. The skin peeled back. It was exhausting, greasy work. The fat coated her hands, turning them white and slippery. The blood soaked into the knees of her dress, drying stiff and cold. They worked in silence for 2 hours. The only sounds were the scrape of steel against bone, the tearing of hide, and the howling of the blizzard beating against the walls. Emmeline's back screamed in agony. Her hands were cramping so badly she could barely hold the knife. She slipped twice, slicing a shallow, stinging cut into her left index finger. She didn't stop to bandage it. She just sucked the blood off and kept cutting. When the hide was finally peeled back and the quarters separated, Gordon sat back on his heels. He was covered in gore. "Haul that quarter to the table." he said, nodding to a massive hind leg. Emmeline grabbed the raw meat. It weighed at least 40 pounds. It was slick, heavy, and dead. She hauled it up against her chest, her corset, digging into her diaphragm, and staggered to the table, dropping it with a wet slap. She turned back. Gordon was watching her. He wasn't smiling, but the hard, appraising look in his eyes had shifted. It was a microscopic change, a slight loosening of his jaw. "Put water in the wash basin," he said, quietly. "You're done." The cabin was suffocatingly warm. The stove roared, fed continuously to boil down the fat in the heavy iron cauldrons. The smell was intense, rich, heavy tallow, and the sharp metallic tang of the salted meat hanging from the rafters. Outside, the blizzard raged on into its second day. They were snowed in. The drifts had piled halfway up the small recessed windows, plunging the cabin into a perpetual dim twilight. Emmeline sat at the table, a bowl of hot water in front of her. She plunged her hands into it. The water was laced with lye soap, and it stung the dozens of tiny cuts and raw blisters covering her palms and fingers. She hissed, biting down on her lower lip, but forced her hands to stay submerged. She had to scrub the dried blood and grease from her skin. Gordon sat by the stove out of the direct light. He had stripped off his bloody coat and shirt, wearing only a faded woolen undershirt. Emmeline aggressively kept her eyes focused on her bowl. She had noticed the scars on his arms when they were butchering thick, ropey burns and jagged silver lines that told stories she didn't want to know. The silence between them stretched thick and heavy. But it felt different today. The frantic, terrified energy that had vibrated in Emmeline's chest since she arrived was gone, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. She pulled her hands from the water, drying them roughly on a flour sack towel. Her skin was raw, bright pink and cracked around the knuckles. "It'll be days before the pass clears," Gordon said suddenly. His voice startled her. It was rough from disuse. Emmeline looked up. He was staring at the stove door, watching the flames flicker through the draught grate. "I know," she replied. "Wood stacked high enough inside. We have meat." He shifted his weight, the chair creaking under him. "You did all right yesterday." It was the closest thing to a compliment he had given her. It felt heavy, like a stone dropped in her lap. "I ruined my only decent dress," she said, looking down at the dark, stiff stains on her skirt. "Wasn't a decent dress for up here anyway," he stated matter-of-factly. "Too tight. Can't breathe. Can't work." Emmeline bristled, her pride flaring. It was appropriate for a civilized town. Not everyone lives in a lightless box on a rock. Gordon turned his head, slowly fixing those pale, unsettling eyes on her. "Civilized town left you standing in the mud. The rock keeps you fed." She opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. He was right. It was a brutal, cynical truth, but it was fact. Arthur Hayes, in his tailored suit and bay rum cologne, had humiliated her for sport. Gordon Cross, smelling of blood and pine, had made her skin a deer. But he hadn't let her starve. "Why did you buy a wife?" she asked. The question slipped out before her brain could stop it. It was a dangerous line to cross. Gordon didn't flinch. He didn't look away. "Didn't buy a wife. Paid your fare." "You paid a magistrate." "Paperwork." He leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on his knees. "Winter's long. Trapping takes 14 hours a day. Last year, I got sick. Fever. Lay in that bed for 6 days. Fire went out. Water froze. Almost didn't wake up." He spoke without emotion, as if reciting a weather report. "I needed someone to keep the fire lit," he finished. "A servant," Emmeline said bitterly. "A partner," he corrected sharply, his voice dropping an octave. "A servant waits to be told what to do. A partner sees the waters low and fetches it. even if they spill half of it in the mud. Emmeline flushed hot. He had seen her fall. He had heard her scream. Humiliation washed over her, hot and prickling. "You were watching me," she accused, her voice tight. "I don't let strangers wander my woods alone. Bare tracks by the creek." He stood up, towering in the small room. He walked over to the shelf above the bed, rummaged behind a tin box, and pulled out a small round tin. He walked back to the table and set it down in front of her. "Bear grease and yarrow," he said. "Put it on your hands. The cuts will fester if the lye dries them out." He didn't wait for a thank you. He turned and walked back to his chair by the stove. Emmeline looked at the small tin. It was battered and dented. She unscrewed the lid. The salve inside smelled strongly of camphor and sharp herbs. She scooped a small amount out with 2 fingers and began rubbing it into her cracked, burning palms. The relief was almost instant. The grease softened the tight, painful skin, and the herbs sent a cooling, numbing sensation over the cuts. She looked across the room at the giant man staring into the fire. He was rough. He was entirely unsentimental. He demanded labor and offered no comfort. Yet as she rubbed the salve into the blisters, she had earned pulling her own weight. A strange, uncomfortable thought took root in her chest. She had hated the factory in Chicago, but she had never felt she belonged anywhere else. She hated the cold, the blood, and the silence of this mountain. But looking at the meat hanging from the rafters meat she had helped butcher, and feeling the heat from the stove she had learned to light, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't just surviving the mountain. She was slowly, painfully becoming a part of it. "Thank you," she said softly into the quiet room. Gordon grunted. He didn't look back, but he didn't correct her either. The blizzard broke on the 7th day, leaving behind a world entirely erased of color. The sky was an aggressive, blinding blue, and the snowdrifts swallowed the tree trunks halfway to their branches. Routine became Emmeline's religion. It was the only thing that kept the sheer, crushing scale of the wilderness from driving her mad. Wake, break ice, haul water, split kindling, boil oats, clean the ash. She moved through the cabin with a stiff, bruised efficiency. The factory in Chicago had demanded speed. The mountain demanded endurance. Gordon had been gone since first light to dig out the lower trap line. It was mid-afternoon, and the pale winter sun was already dipping behind the jagged ridgeline, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow crust. Emmeline was on the porch, a heavy woolen shawl wrapped over her coat, struggling to clear the doorway with a wooden snow shovel. Her breath hung in the still air. Then the mules started screaming. It wasn't a bray. It was a raw, terrified shriek echoing from the lean-to. Emmeline dropped the shovel. The heavy thud of the wood hitting the porch was swallowed by the snow. She grabbed the heavy Winchester rifle resting on the pegs above the door. It was cold heavy and smelled strongly of gun oil. She didn't know how to fire it, but she knew how to hold it. She waded off the porch, the snow instantly plunging over the tops of her boots, soaking her wool stockings. She fought her way toward the lean-to, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Gordon." She called out her voice, swallowed by the vast, frozen silence. She rounded the corner of the rough-hewn timber shed. The grey mule was kicking violently against the stall door, its eyes rolling white in panic. The brown mule was pressed flat against the back wall, shivering. Gordon was sitting in the snow beside the chopping block. He wasn't moving. Emmeline dropped the rifle. She scrambled forward, falling to her knees in the snow beside him. His face was the color of old parchment, entirely drained of blood. His jaw was locked tight, the muscles standing out like iron cables beneath his beard. His heavy canvas coat was unbuttoned, and he was clutching his left thigh with both hands. Dark arterial blood was pulsing slowly between his thick fingers, staining the pristine snow a shocking, violent crimson. Beside him lay a massive, rusted wolf trap. The steel jaws were clamped tight, the thick chain dragging off into the powder. It was heavy enough to snap a bear's leg. "Gordon!" Emmeline's voice cracked. She reached out her hands, hovering uselessly over the blood. "Chain snapped!" he grunted through his teeth. Every word was an agonizing effort. Stepped backward into the drift, lost my footing. Jaws caught me above the knee. He didn't have to explain the rest. He had dragged himself and 30 pounds of iron through half a mile of waist-deep snow to get back to the cabin. "Let me see," she said, her voice shaking. "No." He didn't move his hands. "Arteries nicked. If I let go, I bleed out in 3 minutes." The absolute certainty in his voice slammed into her like a physical blow. Panic, cold and bright, flared in her chest. She couldn't breathe. The air felt too thin. "Look at me." The command was weak, but it demanded obedience. Emmeline forced her eyes away from the blood and looked at his face. His pale grey eyes were dilated dark with pain, but entirely lucid. "Need the poker," he said. "Get the fire hot. White hot. You want me to burn it?" She stammered, her stomach violently protesting. "Cauterize." He corrected his breathing, shallow and rapid. "And bring the whiskey. And my belt. Go." Emmeline scrambled up. Her skirt was heavy with wet snow dragging at her legs. She ran to the cabin, her boots slipping on the porch. She threw the door open, the sudden warmth hitting her face. She moved with frantic, terrified purpose. She shoved 3 thick chunks of dry pine into the stove, opening the draught wide. The fire roared, sucking the air hungrily. She grabbed the heavy iron fire poker and shoved the pointed end deep into the glowing red coals. She found the whiskey, a dusty, unlabeled bottle sitting on a high shelf. She ripped Gordon's heavy leather belt from his spare trousers, hanging on the wall. When she got back outside, Gordon had slumped sideways against the chopping block. His eyes were closed. The pool of blood in the snow had doubled. "Gordon!" His eyes fluttered open. He was fading. The immense, unshakable mountain of a man was crumbling. "Belt!" he rasped. She knelt beside him, her knees sinking into the bloody snow. She threaded the heavy brass buckle, slipping the leather loop up his massive leg, pulling it as high into his groin as she could. "Pull it," he ordered. "Tight as you can." Emmeline grabbed the end of the leather. She braced her boot against his good leg and hauled backward with everything she had. The leather creaked. Gordon let out a sharp, guttural hiss, his head falling back against the wood. "Tighter," he gasped. She pulled until her hands burned, until she thought the leather would snap. She locked the buckle into the tightest hole. Now the iron. Emmeline looked at his hands. He was still gripping his thigh, but his fingers were slackening. "I can't do it," she whispered, tears finally blurring her vision. They were hot and angry. "I'll kill you." Gordon reached out blindly with his right hand. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was weak, his skin clammy and freezing, but it anchored her. "You can," he said. His voice was a bare whisper, but it held no doubt. "You're a survivor, Josie. I saw it on the platform. I see it now. Do it." He called her Josie. She swallowed the sob rising in her throat. She nodded, wiping her face with her sleeve. She ran back to the cabin, grabbing a thick leather work glove. She pulled the iron poker from the stove. The tip was glowing a furious, translucent orange. Heat radiated off it in waves. She ran back to him. "Drink," she commanded, uncorking the whiskey with her teeth and holding it to his lips. He drank deeply, coughing, as the cheap liquor burned his throat. He leaned his head back against the block. "Ready," he breathed. He pulled his hands away from the wound. The blood surged immediately, a dark, heavy pulse soaking through the shredded canvas of his trousers. The trap teeth had torn a ragged, deep trench through the muscle. Emmeline didn't hesitate. If she stopped to think, she would fail. She gripped the poker with both hands and pressed the glowing iron directly into the pulsing center of the wound. The sound was horrific. A violent, wet hiss. The stench of burning meat and singed hair billowed up instantly, a thick, greasy smoke that hit the back of her throat and made her gag. Gordon's body bowed off the snow. A roar tore from his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that belonged to a wounded animal, not a man. His fist slammed into the snow, blindly seeking purchase. Emmeline pressed harder, tears streaming freely down her face, screaming with him as the iron seared the flesh shut. She held it for 5 agonizing seconds until the dark blood stopped flowing, replaced by a charred, blackened crater. She pulled the iron away and threw it into the snow. It hissed, sending up a plume of steam. Gordon was unconscious. His head was slumped forward, his breathing shallow and erratic. Emmeline sat back on her heels. The world was utterly silent again, save for the ragged sound of her own breathing. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to press them flat against her thighs to stop them. She had done it. Now she had to drag 250 pounds of dead weight into the cabin before the frost took them both. The cabin shrank. Over the next 4 days, the 4 rough-hewn log walls seemed to press inward, suffocatingly close. Gordon burned. The infection set in on the 2nd day, a slow, crawling heat that turned the edges of the blackened wound an angry, swollen red. He lay on the heavy furs, his massive chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid hitches. Sweat slicked his skin, matting his thick hair to his forehead. Emmeline barely slept. She existed in a state of hyper-vigilant exhaustion, fueled by weak coffee and absolute terror. She learned the terrifying mechanics of fever. She learned that a man could burn to the touch while shivering violently beneath 3 wool blankets. She boiled water constantly. She steeped willow bark and yarrow, forcing the bitter tea past his chapped lips whenever he woke long enough to swallow. She stripped the fouled bandages, cleaning the weeping wound with carbolic soap, her hands no longer shaking, just moving with a grim, detached necessity. The silence of the mountain had been heavy before. Now it was menacing. There was no doctor. There was no neighbor to ride to. There was only her, the wood stove, and a man fighting a losing battle against sepsis. On the night of the 4th day, the fever peaked. The wind was howling again, throwing hard, dry snow against the window panes like handfuls of sand. The cabin was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, casting long, wavering shadows across the ceiling. Emmeline was sitting in the wooden chair beside the bed, a damp rag in her hand. Her dress was stiff with dried water and spilled tea. Her hair hung in lank, greasy strands around her pale face. Dark, bruised bags hung heavily under her eyes. Gordon thrashed suddenly, his heavy arm striking the log wall with a dull thud. "No!" he muttered, his voice, a dry, cracked rasp. "Keep 'em back. Keep the line." He was trapped in a memory. It had been happening in fragments all day. Shouts, the smell of powder, a name repeated over and over with agonizing regret. Elias. Emmeline leaned forward, pressing the damp rag against his burning forehead. "Shh, Gordon. You're in the cabin. You're safe." His hand shot out, catching her wrist with terrifying speed. His grip was bruising. His eyes snapped open, but they were unseeing, clouded with heat and ghosts. "Elias," he demanded, staring right through her. "Where's the boy? Tell me he didn't cross the river." Emmeline's breath caught. She didn't know an Elias. She knew nothing about this man, really. Only his silence, his work, and the brutal efficiency with which he moved through the world. Now stripped of his armor, she saw the cracks. "He didn't cross," she lied, her voice soft, trying to mimic the deep, soothing tone a mother uses. She placed her free hand over his massive, clenched knuckles. "He's safe, Gordon. Rest." He stared at her for a long second. The tension slowly drained out of his jaw. His eyes fluttered shut and his grip on her wrist loosened, his hand falling back to the furs. "My fault," he whispered into the dark. "Should have checked the ice." The admission hung in the stale air. It was a confession dragged up from the very bottom of his soul by the fever. Emmeline pulled the rag away and dipped it back into the bowl of cool water. She wrung it out, the sound loud in the quiet room. She looked at him. The imposing, terrifying mountain man who had bought her like cattle was gone. In his place was just a man, broken, haunted, and dying. She realized with a sudden sharp clarity that bypassed her exhausted brain and settled directly in her chest that she didn't hate him. The anger she had clung to since Oakmere, the burning resentment that had kept her warm during those first freezing trips to the creek had evaporated. It had been burned away by the shared blood in the snow, by the terrifying responsibility of holding a life in her hands. If he died, she could probably survive the winter. She knew how to keep the fire now. She knew how to ration the meat. When spring came, she could take the mule's ride down the mountain and never look back. She would be free. She looked at the rise and fall of his chest. She didn't want to be free. Not like that. The thought terrified her far more than the wolves or the winter. She had spent her entire life in Chicago, keeping her head down, protecting her own meager existence, expecting nothing but hardship from the world and the men in it. But Gordon, in his brutal, unyielding way, had never lied to her. He had demanded her labor, but he had never diminished her. A partner, he had said. Even if they spill half of it in the mud. He had seen her at her absolute lowest, humiliated and covered in dirt, and he hadn't pitied her. He had expected her to stand up. Emmeline leaned her elbows on her knees and buried her face in her rough, scarred hands. "Don't you die on me, Gordon Cross," she whispered into the empty cabin. Her voice was fiercely possessive. "I didn't burn a hole in your leg just to bury you in the frozen dirt. You owe me." She sat up, grabbed the cup of willow bark tea, and pinched his nose shut. When his mouth opened on a gasp, she poured the bitter liquid down his throat, holding his jaw until he reflexively swallowed. She sat back down, picked up the rag, and began to wipe his face again. She would sit there until the fire went out, or the fever broke. She wouldn't let the mountain take him. The smell woke him. It wasn't the sharp, sterile scent of carbolic soap, or the metallic tang of blood, or the heavy, sour reek of his own fever sweat. It was the smell of roasting fat, coffee, and something else, something distinctly, shockingly sweet. Gordon opened his eyes. The light in the cabin was entirely different. It wasn't the dim, oppressive grey of the blizzard, nor the wavering yellow of the oil lamp. It was bright. True, unfiltered sunlight was streaming through the small windows, painting warm squares of light on the rough floorboards. He tried to move. His left leg felt like it was encased in solid iron, stiff and throbbing with a dull, heavy ache. He shifted his weight, letting out a low grunt as the muscles pulled against the tight stitching. The sound of movement near the stove stopped. Emmeline turned around. Gordon stared at her. He felt as though he had been asleep for a decade. She looked different. The pristine, useless wool dress from Oakmere was gone. She was wearing a pair of his old canvas trousers, cinched tight at the waist with a length of rope, and a faded flannel shirt, with the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Her hair was braided tightly down her back, and there was a smudge of flour on her cheek. She looked exhausted. She looked thinner. But she didn't look fragile anymore. The terrified, hollow-eyed girl from the train platform had vanished, replaced by someone rooted, someone carved from the same hard wood as the cabin itself. She walked over to the bed, wiping her hands on a scrap of toweling. "You're awake," she said. Her voice was quiet, lacking its usual defensive edge. "Seems so," he croaked. His throat felt like it was lined with broken glass. She reached to the washstand, poured water into a tin cup and held it to his mouth. He drank greedily the cool water, the best thing he had ever tasted. He sank back against the furs, his chest heaving slightly from the effort. He looked down at his leg. The heavy bandages were clean. "How long?" he asked. 10 days, Emmeline answered, setting the cup down. "The fever broke 2 nights ago. You've been sleeping since. 10 days. He looked at the wood box. It was full. He looked at the water buckets. Full. The cabin was clean. The stove was hot. He looked back at her. Her hands were resting on her hips. They were rough red and scarred the hands of someone who had pulled their weight, and then some. "You kept the fire," he said softly. "I told you I could make a stew out of a boot heel," she replied, the ghost of a wry smile pulling at the corner of her mouth, though I found the elk meat significantly easier to chew. Gordon didn't smile, but the hard, impenetrable wall behind his pale grey eyes fractured. He saw the dark circles under her eyes. He knew exactly what it took to keep this place alive alone. He knew the fear, the bone-deep cold, the paralyzing silence. She had faced all of it while dragging him back from the edge of the grave. "Elias," he said suddenly. Emmeline stiffened slightly, her hand dropping from her hip. "You talked about him," she admitted quietly. "When the fever was bad." Gordon stared at the ceiling beams. The guilt, usually a crushing physical weight in his chest, felt strangely lighter in the bright sunlight. "My younger brother." He said the words rusty and slow. 10 years ago. We were trapping up the North Fork. Late spring thaw. I told him the ice was thick enough to cross with the pack horses. I was wrong. He stopped. He didn't need to say the rest. The sound of cracking ice, the black rushing water, the absolute paralyzing helplessness. It had driven him up here, away from people, away from the risk of ever being responsible for a life again. Until he saw a woman standing in the mud in Oakmere, abandoned and drowning in her own way. "It wasn't your fault," Emmeline said. Her voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "I was the older brother. It was my job to know. You're a man, Gordon, not God. You misjudged the ice." She walked closer to the bed. "Just like you misjudged the drift when you stepped backward into that trap. You make mistakes. You bleed." He looked at her, really looked at her. "Why didn't you leave?" he asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and fragile. "When the fever broke, you could have packed the mule. The pass is clearing. You're free." Emmeline stood perfectly still. She looked at the giant man in the bed. He was scarred, missing pieces of his soul, demanding and utterly maddening. But he was hers. They had forged something brutal and unbreakable in the crucible of the last 10 days. She reached out. Not with a damp rag or a cup of bitter tea. She reached out and placed her scarred, calloused hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. She felt the steady, strong beat beneath his ribs. "I didn't take your name to be a servant, Gordon," she said, her voice dropping, holding his gaze with absolute, unblinking certainty. "And I didn't burn a hole in your leg to let you die. You said you needed a partner." She let her fingers curl slightly, gripping the rough fabric of his undershirt. "I'm not going back to the mud," she said fiercely. "This is my home now. Gordon covered her hand with his own. His grip was weak, but his palm was warm. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. He pulled her hand, slightly drawing her down. Emmeline leaned forward. The kiss wasn't a sweeping romantic collision. It was slow, tentative, and tasted of stale coffee and survival. It was chapped lips, and the desperate, profound relief of two people who had spent their entire lives braced for a blow, finally realizing they could lower their hands. He pulled back slightly, his pale eyes searching her face. "Smells like sweet bread," he muttered. Emmeline let out a short, startled laugh, the sound bright and entirely new in the heavy timber cabin. "Dried apples and flour," she corrected, standing up and smoothing the front of her borrowed trousers. "I traded a jar of bear grease to the peddler who came through yesterday while you were snoring. Thought we deserved something that wasn't salted pork." Gordon watched her walk back to the stove. The rigid defensive posture she had carried since the train station was gone. She moved with a casual, confident ownership of the space. He shifted his leg, wincing at the pain, but the deep, gnawing cold that had lived inside him for 10 years was gone. The thaw had finally come to the mountain. "Josie," he called out. She paused, a heavy iron skillet in her hand, and looked back over her shoulder. "Yes." He settled back against the furs, the ghost of a genuine smile finally touching his eyes. "Can you cook?" If Emmeline and Gordon's brutal journey through the winter wilderness kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button to let us know the frontier is entirely unforgiving. But sometimes the harshest environments forge the most unbreakable bonds. Don't forget to share this story with someone who loves a gritty, realistic romance, and subscribe to the channel for more raw, untamed tales. Ring